The defense chiefs of both Germany and the UK have written a joint article published by The Guardian and Germany's Die Welt newspaper, making what they say is the moral case for European rearmament, pointing to the growing threat from Russia. Air Chief Marshal Richard Knighton, the UK's chief of the defense staff, and General Carsten Breuer, Germany's chief of defense, say Moscow's military stance has, quote, shifted decisively westward, and that they believe to have a duty to explain to the public why they're pushing for the biggest increase in defense spending since the Cold War. Here's some of what they wrote. Through the early years of our careers, Europe was emerging from the shadow of the Cold War. Governments of all political colors chose to take what was known as the peace dividend, investing in public services and reducing spending on defense. That was an understandable choice at the time. Now it's clear that the threats we face demand a step change in our defense and security. And that appears to be a sentiment shared by the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who had this to say when asked by journalists about a report suggesting the UK government is considering bringing forward its target to spend 3% of economic output on defense.
So we need to step up. That means on defence spending, we need to go faster. We've obviously made commitments already in relation to that. But it goes beyond just how much you spend. It's also whether you coordinate and collaborate with other like-minded countries, particularly in Europe. And that's the case I've been making, which is that in addition to how much you spend, it's got to be how you work together as a group of countries. How we make NATO stronger, a European NATO.
Let's keep talking about this and bring in Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome to the day, sir. Now, the chiefs call for a step change. The Prime Minister says Europe needs to step up. What does that mean in practical terms, though?
Well, it means what it says is that the UK in particular has made promises about increasing defence spending, has done so a bit, but not as much as needed to. And late last year, it looked like the British Ministry of Defence was struggling to make the case for the billions of extra pounds that are needed. So I think this comes as a way of pushing the government to be a bit bolder with its current plans, because not only is the question of what needs to be done to support Ukraine, there's also the question of whether or not one can continue to rely on the United States as a major factor in European security. So the situation has become more urgent over the past year, and I think that's the main reason behind this push.
But do you think this push puts us actually closer to the 3% or Trump's preferred 5% in defense spending that we've been talking about for so long?
We're a long way from 5% in practice. This will get us closer to the 3%, which in itself is quite a shift from the barely 2% that we were at not that long ago. So I think we'll get that possibly a bit more, but it's a long way before we're going to get to 5%.
You mentioned a heightened sense of urgency there. Where do you believe that comes from? Is it just a more unreliable United States, or is there more to the timing of this?
I think the United States has got a lot to do with it. First, because there's the shock of the Greenland issue and other issues mean that the US just seems a less reliable ally. But also, if you want to keep the US as an ally at all, you've got to show that you can do more for yourself. This has been one of the main pitches of Trump since his first term. And it's one that other American presidents have also agreed with. So if you have any hope of keeping the United States with some confidence in its own allies, then you've got to show that you can do more. So I think it fits in on both sides. It's a hedge against the Americans leaving us alone, but it also provides a better chance of keeping the Americans on side.
Is it fair, in your opinion, to describe the post-Cold War peace dividend as an understandable choice at the time, as the chiefs do in their letter? Or does that framing maybe let European governments off the hook too easily?
It would have been very hard in the 1990s not to expect some peace dividend. All European governments had spent a lot on the basis that the Soviet Union, with the Warsaw Pact, was a determined adversary. Then the Soviet Union falls apart, the Warsaw Pact evaporates, many of its members join NATO. You couldn't make the same claims about the threat in the 1990s. So I don't think it was a surprising choice. You could argue that we were a bit slow to realize that it had gone too far. And I think many people now would put the real problem down to perhaps the 2010, 2014 period, especially when Putin annexed Crimea, when it was clear that we were in a much more serious and difficult stage of international relations.
Yeah. The reckoning really came now almost 4 years ago after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you remember, as people here in Germany well do, the previous Chancellor Olaf Scholz proclaimed a turning point. Do you think we're now seeing that coming to fruition 4 years on under his successor, Friedrich Merz? Is Germany ready to take the lead on European defense?
Well, Germany is taking much more of the lead, and that is making an important difference. It has money to spend. It has factories that are available to step up military production, and it's the biggest economy in Europe. So, yes, it is making a much more important contribution and is being much bolder in explaining why this is being done. So I think Germany under Merz is taking more of the lead and working very closely, not just with the United Kingdom, but also with France in trying to give European security a sense of strong direction and giving support to Ukraine in the process.
Historically speaking, would you say that reduced European defense spending has encouraged Russian aggression in the past?
I don't think by itself. I think the problem was more in the period I mentioned before, 2014 to, in the period I mentioned before, 2010 to 2014, there was an evident reluctance in Europe to get too involved. You could look at the Syrian civil war as well as the annexation of Crimea. So I think it was the rather tepid response to Crimea and the determination somehow to work with Russia as usual that gave Russia more confidence that when they moved to the full-scale invasion in 2020, that the response then would be equally limited and modest. I think what happened was because the war didn't go as Russia had planned, the Ukrainians managed to resist, and the Allies were bound to step up then because clearly they had to give support to a country that was fighting so bravely for its independence.
I want to bring up something else the chiefs said in their letter. They say there is a moral dimension to this endeavor. Rearmament is not warmongering. It is the responsible action of nations determined to protect their people and preserve peace. Strength deters aggression. Weakness invites it. When rearmament is framed as a moral duty, does that change how openly societies can argue about what they're giving up to pay for it?
There's going to be bound to be arguments about national priorities, about big demands on domestic expenditure. So, yeah, there's always going to be a debate on this. I think framing it as a moral responsibility in some way is designed to take away the argument that this is purely realpolitik, geopolitics as usual, and recognise that the issues at stake are not just sort of the balance of power in Europe, but the values of the West, and that if we fail Ukraine and fail to show Russia that it will face a determined opposition if it tries aggression against other European countries, that we're protecting our values. So I think in that sense it is a moral issue, and those who want to argue against the rearmament have got to make the case that it's not, that somehow this is that we can let aggression pass by and not take a response.
Yeah, perhaps in that line, the letter also calls for a whole of society approach to defense. They call it a task for each and every one of us. What exactly does that mean for European civilians going forward, and what happens if, the case they're making doesn't land with the public?
Yeah, I think this is a challenge for European governments because really there's not much expectation in either Germany or the UK that they're likely to be in the middle of a big fighting war in the near future. What you can say is that in a variety of ways, Russia is already engaged in what's sometimes described as grey area activities, information campaigns, cyber attacks, even sabotage, drone incursions into some European countries, and so on. And these are an everyday challenge for European societies. So I think partly it's making people aware that the issue is not just sort of the classic Armageddon of a World War III, but sustained pressure by Russia to divide us, to try to discourage us from giving support to Ukraine, and this is ongoing. So in that sense, you do need citizens engaged. I think it's a difficult issue frankly to get over, because on the one hand, you don't want to sort of panic people to think that a big war is around the corner. On the other hand, it's clearly no time to be complacent.
Thanks for your insights. Pleasure speaking to you today. That was Sir Lawrence Freedman, Professor Emeritus at King's College London.
Thank you.